And what this study found is that they looked at 135 studies for which they had data. A third of the studies showed high added clinical benefit, and two-thirds showed a low added clinical benefit. But the key here, there are two keys. Number one is that the drug companies spent 3 times more marketing the low added clinical benefit drugs than they did the high added clinical drugs. And the other point is that in the United States, unlike the other wealthy countries, we don't have an agency of health technology assessment. So the National Institute of Clinical Excellence in the UK, for example, and in Germany and in France and in Canada and all the other wealthy countries, they have independent agencies that evaluate the value of new drugs and make recommendations to the government for coverage and price, and to doctors for which drugs they should prescribe. But in the United States, we don't have such an agency. And sometimes people think, well, the FDA, that's the FDA's job, but it's not. The FDA's job is to approve new medicines or old medicines for new indications, to approve them because at least one study has shown that the drug provides significant benefit and not a counteracting harm, more benefit than harm, and a significant benefit. So the FDA's job is to determine which drugs doctors are allowed to prescribe. But the FDA plays no role in informing doctors which drugs they should prescribe. And in fact, I've been involved in a number of situations where the FDA was fully aware that the results of a clinical trial were published in a medical journal, and they were published inaccurately, but the FDA knew it was inaccurate, but they don't correct the mistakes. So they know that doctors are being misinformed, and they are the only ones with the data, and they don't correct the journals. And the end result of all this is that without a formal mechanism of health technology assessment, US doctors can't identify which new drugs truly provide previously unavailable benefit. That in the United States, we saw how much more expensive the weight loss drugs were in the United States than the other countries. And that extra money, in part, fuels the excessive marketing efforts. You get to see the tip of that iceberg when you watch TV and you're just bombarded with drug ads. Let me add that the word is that whenever a TV segment is bounded by a drug ad, there's not somebody who might be critical of the pharmaceutical industry. So when my first book came out in 2004, and Vioxx was pulled from the market a week thereafter because yet another study showed its cardiovascular risk, and I'll get into that in a bit. But when that book came out, I was all over the TV, national TV, and the media, and op-ed pieces and coverage in magazines and so forth. This book that I just published in 2022, I got virtually no coverage on TV. In fact, it's quirky, but the only person who covered me was Tucker Carlson. Obviously, I have some ambivalence about, but he covered me and covered me honestly. But because new drugs are so much more expensive and because marketing is so much less restricted in the United States, new drugs diffuse more quickly, whether they're effective or not. Brand name drugs cost 3.5 times more in the United States than in other OECD countries. And as I said before, 2/3 to 3/4 of global pharmaceutical profits come from the United States because of our marketing, the price of brand name drugs, and the extent of the drug advertising and other marketing that goes on. So let me show you what can happen. This is a true story. I've changed these emails only to protect the identity of the individuals involved. But when my first book came out in 2004 and Vioxx was pulled from the market a week later, I got catapulted onto the national scene and was on the Today Show The next day, I had hardly done any interviews, and suddenly I was on the Today Show. And I got called back on the Today Show about 6 weeks after that because another drug got into trouble. So this is an email I got after the second time I was on the Today Show. It's dated December 2004. And the subject, I haven't changed anything. This is an old email address, so don't try it. But the subject of the email is Vioxx death of 17-year-old. Need your professional opinion. And the text is, Dear Doctor, my name is XXX. I was wondering if you would be willing to review our daughter's autopsy report. It would be a blessing to us. Please help us. My daughter Stacy was 17 years old. The identity is disguised here. My daughter Stacy was 17 years old. She passed away on September 11th, 2004. This is a week before Vioxx was pulled from the market. Almost 5 years after Merck knew about its cardiovascular risks, but didn't kept marketing the drug. So my daughter Stacy was 17 years old. She passed away September 11th, 2004. We haven't been able to really get any straight answers in our situation. We would really appreciate any opinions or help you could give our family on this case. Thank you. I mean, this is just heartbreaking. I got to know the mother. We spoke on the phone several times, and just heartbreaking. So let me show you the result of the privatization of medical data and the non-transparency of peer review, that this lady, this young girl, lost her life because of this. This is an email that was written on the day that the Vioxx trial, let me backtrack a bit. Vioxx was approved in May of 1999. It was approved for arthritis and pain, but it was not approved for what Merck thought was its primary marketing advantage, that it was more gentle on the stomach and less likely to cause serious GI bleeding and other problems. So Merck, as all the companies do, and it makes perfect sense, I'm not being critical, Merck got the drug approved based on its efficacy for treating arthritis and pain, and saved the study, the safety study, that would hopefully show that it was safer than the other non-specific anti-inflammatory drugs like Advil or naproxen and so forth. They saved that study for later. They wanted to get their drug approved on the market. And then they did a study called the Vioxx study, gastrointestinal outcomes research study. And when a study is done, it's double-blinded, and the company executives aren't allowed to look at the data until the study is complete. And then the study can be unblinded because unblinding it and knowing who took which drug won't affect the results. So the Vioxx had been approved and went on sale in the United States in May 1999. In March of 2000, the Vioxx study of gastrointestinal safety was completed and unblinded. So when this study was unblinded, Merck's president of research got the data and saw the data from the study. He was the first Merck employee to see the data. And he wrote this email based on what he saw of the data. And the print is small, but I'll highlight the important sections of this email. So he's writing to Deborah Shapiro and Elise Reisen. They're both high-ranking scientists in Merck. And Alan Nice is the vice president of Merck Research. And it's from Edward Skolnick, who's the president of Merck Research. And it's written on March 9th, 2000, the day that the Vioxx trial was unblinded. He says here in this text, the cardiovascular events are clearly there. This is real. He's not hiding it. He's being honest. He says, it's a shame, but it's a low incidence and it's mechanism based as we worried it was, meaning the physiological mechanism of creating an anti-inflammatory drug that would be less likely to cause serious gastrointestinal problems, could, he is saying, they were aware, and they were aware as early as 1996, I think, that by making it less likely, making a drug less likely to cause GI problems, it might increase the clotability of the blood and increase the risk of cardiovascular problems. That's what he's saying. They knew it. They were looking for it. He says this class of drugs, meaning the anti-inflammatory drugs that were supposed to be gentler on the stomach, called cyclooxygenase 2 inhibitors, selective inhibitors, or COX-2 selective inhibitors, he says this class will do well, and so will we. Now, this is the heart of the dragon. This is a high-ranking executive, the president of Merck Research Labs, is saying that the class of drugs will do well, meaning financially, and we will do well, meaning financially. Now, what that means is that the executives in the drug companies, a large part of their remuneration comes from stock options and stock grants. So what this reflects is the culture of the top level of executives at Merck and all the other drug companies as well, who are so integrated into this culture of maximizing their remuneration through their stock options, that he is saying the class will do well, and so will we. He's saying that we're not going to be slowed down in our financial gain by the fact that the CV events are real and clearly there. Now remember, this is about a 17-year-old girl who died of a massive brain hemorrhage that was almost certainly due to Vioxx. So how did Merck, from the president of Merck Research saying these things, publish an article that didn't sink Vioxx sales? So the article was published, the study was written up and submitted to the New England Journal, peer-reviewed, and published November 23rd, 2000. So was that 6 months after March or something like that when he looked at the data? And the bottom line of the article says, comparison of upper gastrointestinal toxicity of Vioxx and naproxen in patients with rheumatoid arthritis. And the conclusion of the article is, in patients with rheumatoid arthritis, treatment with Vioxx, a selective inhibitor of cyclooxygenase 2, is associated with significantly fewer clinically important upper GI events than treatment with naproxen, a non-selective inhibitor. And that's where it was left. The article did not report the increase in cardiovascular events in the people, the higher rate of cardiovascular events in the people who took Vioxx. It was a pre-specified endpoint. The president of Merck Research knew about it within hours of the data being unblinded on March 9th, 2000. And the New England Journal article didn't even report it. Now this is where my career as a pharmaceutical critic began, on this table, because there was a footnote in an article in JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, that led to the documents that Merck had submitted to the FDA to be presented at its advisory committee meeting in February of 2001. And this was in the FDA's cardiovascular review of the VIGOR database. So this is the summary of confirmed adjudicated thrombotic cardiovascular serious adverse events, heart attacks, blood clots, and strokes that were serious enough to land somebody in the hospital. And they did all thrombotic events, which was a pre-specified endpoint, Vioxx and naproxen. And what Merck reported to the FDA was that the people who took naproxen had only 42% as much risk of having a cardiovascular event as the people who took Vioxx. Now, this was a clever manipulation because Merck tried to argue to the FDA that it wasn't Vioxx that increased the risk of cardiovascular events. It was naproxen that decreased the risk of cardiovascular events. The FDA threw it out immediately, said there's no logic behind this, there's no evidence to support it. And in fact, what they turned to immediately was doing the inverse of the 0.42 relative risk. And they did 1 over 0.42. And in the FDA's reports, they said the relative risk of a serious cardiovascular event with Vioxx instead of naproxen is 2.38. The risk of a serious cardiovascular event is more than doubled. Now remember, this sounds geeky. It's in the weeds. I enjoy being in the weeds, I confess. But remember, this 17-year-old girl died, and she was one of 50,000 people who died from taking Vioxx. So what's in the weeds here is really important. And most important, cardiovascular events more than doubling is critically important. Had that been properly reported in the New England Journal article, it probably would have been the end of the drug. And had the New England Journal demanded the data from Merck, that this data that you're looking at right now, it probably would have been the end of the drug because Merck would have been so liable, they would have understood their liability. But the real result that we need to know is from the FDA's statistical review of the VIGOR trial, because the claim that Merck was making is that Vioxx is safer than other drugs. That's why you should use it. There was never a claim that it was a more potent pain reliever or arthritis medication. The studies showed that it's as good as the other drugs, but it's not better. So the only reason for taking Vioxx was that it's safer. So now we go to all serious clinical adverse events. So all the adverse events that occurred in the VIGOR trial that were serious enough to land somebody in the hospital. And we find that there's a 21% increase. Merck is marketing the drug because they're claiming it's safer because it causes fewer GI problems. There's a 21% increase in the risk of serious adverse events, and that's highly statistically significant. And if you take the rates, here are the rates per 100 people. The rates of serious adverse events. And if you subtract 14.48, which is the rate for people, if you take 14.48, the rate for people who took Vioxx, and subtract the rate for people who took naproxen, and you divide the result of that into 100, because it's rates per 100 patients, you find the number of people that you have to treat each year in order to cause one person to have a serious enough side effect to end up in the hospital. And what this table shows you when you do the arithmetic that I've done is that out of every 40 people who good doctors practicing evidence-based medicine, reading the New England Journal, for those doctors prescribing Vioxx to their patients instead of standard non-selective anti-inflammatory drugs, because they believe it's safer, for every 40 people that's treated with Vioxx, one was harmed enough to warrant hospitalization. This is an enormously dangerous drug. I mean, you've got to treat 100 to 140 people for 5 years to prevent a single cardiovascular event with a statin in order to prevent one non-fatal heart attack or stroke. And here we see the number needed to harm is 40. So good doctors thinking that they're taking the best care of their patients because they're providing the latest evidence-based medicine were actually harming their patients. And that's exactly what happened to our patient, Stacy, who had some head trauma and it didn't respond to non-selective anti-inflammatory drug. So the doctor, out of the kindness of his heart, gave her 8 Vioxx tablets that the Merck representative had left in his office to treat Stacy with the Vioxx to see if she would get better. And she was dead within 2 weeks.